the Sackler Wing at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Sackler Library at Oxford University, the Sackler Gallery at the Smithsonian. For decades, the Sackler name represented culture, education, and generosity. Museums competed for Sackler donations. Universities named buildings after them. The family appeared on lists of the world's greatest philanthropists, their fortune estimated at over $13 billion. But what almost nobody knew was where that money actually came from. Behind the art collections and the academic buildings was a pharmaceutical operation that helped create the deadliest drug epidemic in American history, a crisis that has killed more than 500,000 people and counting. This is the story of how the Sackler family turned pain into profit, addiction into art galleries, and an opioid crisis into a billion-dollar empire. The story begins not with pills, but with advertising. In the 1950s, Arthur Sackler was a psychiatrist in New York, but his real genius was marketing. He pioneered techniques for pharmaceutical advertising that seem obvious now, but were revolutionary then. Instead of selling directly to patients, Arthur realized you should sell to doctors. He created medical journals that looked educational, but were actually advertising platforms. He bought a company that allowed him to track which doctors prescribed which drugs, then targeted them with tailored marketing campaigns. He convinced pharmaceutical companies to sponsor medical conferences where their drugs would be prominently featured. It was sophisticated, systematic, and enormously effective. Arthur's first major success came with Valium in the 1960s. Using aggressive marketing to physicians, he helped transform Valium from an obscure sedative into the most prescribed drug in America. By 1978, Valium sales reached 2 billion pills annually. The strategy was simple but powerful. Position the drug as safe and non-addictive. Market it for common conditions. Give doctors free samples, glossy materials, and incentives to prescribe. Create the perception that not prescribing the drug meant a doctor wasn't up to date with modern medicine. It worked spectacularly. But Arthur's real legacy wasn't Valium. It was what his brothers Mortimer and Raymond learned from watching him work. In 1952, the three Sackler brothers had purchased a small pharmaceutical company called Purdue Frederick. For decades, it remained a modest operation producing laxatives and earwax removal solutions. Arthur died in 1987, before Purdue's transformation into a pharmaceutical giant. But Mortimer and Raymond took Arthur's marketing blueprint and applied it to a new product that would dwarf Valium's success. In 1996, Purdue Pharma, now fully controlled by Mortimer and Raymond's branches of the Sackler family, launched OxyContin. The drug was oxycodone, a powerful opioid, combined with a time-release mechanism that theoretically made it safer than other painkillers. Purdue marketed OxyContin as a breakthrough for chronic pain, a non-addictive alternative to existing opioids. The key claim, repeated in thousands of marketing materials, was that the time-release formula made addiction unlikely. Less than 1% of patients would become addicted. Purdue's representatives told doctors it was safe for chronic pain. It was appropriate for conditions like back pain and arthritis, not just severe cancer pain. Every single one of those claims was either misleading or outright false. Evidence suggests the Sackler family knew it. Internal Purdue documents later revealed in court show that company executives understood OxyContin's addiction potential from the beginning. They knew patients were crushing pills to defeat the time-release mechanism and get the full dose at once. They knew doctors were prescribing OxyContin in dangerous combinations. They knew that areas with high OxyContin prescribing rates were seeing addiction spikes. And rather than pulling back, they pushed harder. Purdue built a sales force of over 1,000 representatives, far larger than competitors, specifically trained to market OxyContin aggressively. Sales reps visited doctors with one goal: increase OxyContin prescriptions. They brought gifts, paid for meals, sponsored seminars at resorts. Doctors who prescribed high volumes of OxyContin were rewarded with speaking fees and additional attention. Purdue tracked prescriptions obsessively, targeting the highest prescribers and pushing them to prescribe even more. Between 1996 and 2002, Purdue spent over $200 million on marketing OxyContin, more than the company spent on research and development. The campaign worked beyond Purdue's projections. In 1996, OxyContin sales were $45 million. By 2000, sales reached over $1 billion. By 2010, OxyContin alone generated $3 billion in annual revenue. The Sackler family, which owned Purdue entirely through a web of trusts and holding companies, extracted extraordinary wealth. Between 2008 and 2017 alone, the Sacklers withdrew over $10 billion from Purdue Pharma in distributions. This wasn't profit from selling shares or going public. This was cash taken directly out of the company and deposited into Sackler family accounts. But the human cost was mounting at a terrifying rate. OxyContin didn't just treat pain, it created addicts. Patients prescribed OxyContin for routine injuries found themselves physically dependent on opioids. When prescriptions ran out, many turned to illegal sources. Some crushed and snorted OxyContin pills to get an immediate high. Others transitioned to heroin, which became cheaper and more accessible than prescription pills. Emergency rooms began seeing overdoses at unprecedented rates. Rural communities, where OxyContin had been marketed especially aggressively, were devastated. In some Appalachian towns, entire generations became addicted. By 2007, the crisis had become impossible to ignore. The federal government charged Purdue Pharma with misleading doctors and patients about OxyContin's addiction risk. Purdue pleaded guilty to felony charges and paid $635 million in fines, one of the largest pharmaceutical settlements in history at the time. 3 executives were charged with crimes. The company admitted in court that it had marketed OxyContin as less addictive and less subject to abuse than it actually was. But here's the critical detail. The Sackler family faced no personal charges. The settlement was paid by Purdue, not by the family members who owned and controlled the company. And Purdue didn't pull OxyContin from the market. Instead, the company reformulated OxyContin to make it harder to crush. A change that did almost nothing to address addiction, but allowed Purdue to market the drug as abuse deterrent. Sales continued. The Sacklers continued extracting billions, and the death toll continued rising. What makes the Sackler strategy particularly disturbing is how systematically it was executed. This wasn't reckless management or accidental negligence. Internal emails and documents revealed in later lawsuits show that members of the Sackler family were deeply involved in Purdue's operations. Richard Sackler, son of Raymond, and at times Purdue's president and board chairman, personally directed marketing strategies. Emails show him pushing sales representatives to be more aggressive, dismissing concerns about addiction, and strategizing about how to expand into new markets. In one email from 2001, Richard Sackler blamed OxyContin overdoses on the users themselves, writing that addicts were the culprits and the problem. Another email discussed how Purdue could profit from addiction by selling addiction treatment drugs alongside OxyContin. The company explored buying companies that made drugs to treat opioid addiction, effectively creating a business model where Purdue would profit both from creating addicts and from treating the addiction it had created. Meanwhile, the Sackler family used their pharmaceutical wealth to build one of the great art collections of the modern era, and to plaster their name on cultural institutions worldwide. The Sackler wing at the Met, completed in 1978, houses the Temple of Dindur. The Sackler Library at Oxford opened in 2021. The Sackler Galleries appeared at the Louvre, the Guggenheim, and the Serpentine in London. Universities from Columbia to Tufts to Tel Aviv created Sackler programs and buildings. The total philanthropic contributions reached hundreds of millions of dollars, and for years it worked exactly as intended. The Sackler name became synonymous with culture and refinement. Museum curators attended Sackler family dinners. University presidents praised Sackler generosity. Nobody in the art world asked where the money came from, or if they did, they accepted the answer that it came from a legitimate pharmaceutical business. After all, Purdue made pain medicine. Pain relief was important. What could be wrong with that? But by 2015, the opioid crisis had become too large to ignore and too deadly to dismiss as a problem of individual behavior. Over 33,000 Americans died from opioid overdoses in 2015. By 2017, that number reached 47,000. Investigations by journalists, particularly reporting in the Los Angeles Times and the New Yorker, began connecting the dots between Purdue's marketing, the Sackler family's wealth, and the bodies piling up in emergency rooms and morgue across America. In 2019, Purdue Pharma filed for bankruptcy, overwhelmed by over 2,600 lawsuits from states, municipalities, tribes, and individuals. The company proposed a settlement that would dissolve Purdue, redirect its assets to addiction treatment, and require the Sackler family to contribute $3 billion from their personal fortune. In exchange, the Sacklers would receive complete immunity from all current and future civil lawsuits related to OxyContin. But that settlement revealed just how much wealth the family had extracted. Court documents showed that between 2008 and 2018, the Sacklers had transferred over $10 billion from Purdue to family trusts and offshore accounts. Much of that money was moved to holding companies in places like Luxembourg and the British Virgin Islands, jurisdictions with strong asset protection laws. The timing was revealing. Transfers accelerated dramatically after 2007, when Purdue first faced serious legal scrutiny, suggesting the family was systematically moving assets beyond the reach of potential lawsuits. Public outrage finally caught up with the Sackler name. The photographer Nan Golden, herself a survivor of OxyContin addiction, led protests at museums that displayed the Sackler name. Activists scattered pill bottles in the Sackler wing at the Met and at the Sackler galleries in London. The message was simple, but devastating. Every time you see the Sackler name, remember the 500,000 dead. One by one, institutions began removing the Sackler name. The Louvre announced it would no longer use the Sackler name in its galleries. The Met stopped accepting Sackler donations and removed Sackler signage. The Tate galleries in London did the same. Oxford considered renaming the Sackler Library. Universities that had created Sackler programs distanced themselves from the family. The name that had represented culture and philanthropy for decades was now toxic. In 2021, Purdue's bankruptcy settlement was finalized. The company would be dissolved. Its assets would go toward addiction treatment and abatement programs. The Sackler family would contribute $4.5 billion, an increase from the initial offer, paid out over 9 years. In exchange, they received immunity from all civil opioid lawsuits. Criminal prosecution remained theoretically possible, but no Sackler family member has been charged with a crime related to OxyContin. The settlement means that the Sackler family, after paying out the settlement over 9 years, will likely still retain several $billion in personal wealth. Money that was extracted from Purdue during the years when OxyContin killed hundreds of thousands of Americans. Money that is now largely protected in offshore trusts and holding companies. Money that was used to buy art, fund museums, and create a legacy of culture while the opioid crisis destroyed communities. What makes the Sackler story particularly chilling is that it reveals how legal structures can protect enormous wealth, even when the source of that wealth is catastrophic harm. Purdue Pharma was a private company, entirely owned by the Sackler family through trusts. Those trusts created a legal firewall between the family and the company. When Purdue faced lawsuits, the company could be bankrupted, but the family's personal assets remained largely protected. The distributions that the Sacklers took from Purdue over the years were technically legal, even if morally indefensible. The opioid crisis that Purdue helped create continues. While OxyContin prescriptions have declined, the addiction epidemic it helped trigger hasn't stopped. Many people addicted to prescription opioids transitioned to heroin or fentanyl when prescriptions became harder to obtain. Drug overdose deaths in the United States reached over 100,000 in 2021, driven largely by synthetic opioid. The crisis that Purdue's marketing helped ignite in the 1990s has mutated into an even deadlier form. And the Sackler family, the name that once graced museums and universities, has effectively vanished from public life. Family members have largely stopped making public statements. They no longer appear at cultural events. The philanthropy has ceased. The art collection remains private. The billions extracted from Purdue sit in trusts and accounts, beyond the reach of most lawsuits, a monument to the ability of wealth to insulate itself from consequences. There's a deeper pattern here that goes beyond one family or one drug. The Sackler strategy was to take a known dangerous product, opioids, and use marketing and political influence to normalize its prescription for conditions it was never intended to treat. They identified a gap in regulation, the FDA's relatively lax oversight of opioid marketing in the 1990s, and exploited it systematically. They created a distribution network, the physician-prescriber system, that shifted risk away from the company and onto individual doctors and patients. And when the consequences became undeniable, they used legal structures to protect their wealth, while the company they owned absorbed the liability. This wasn't reckless capitalism. It was calculated extraction of profit from human suffering, executed with the same precision that Arthur Sackler once used to market Valium. The family understood exactly what they were building. Emails show it. Internal documents prove it. Prosecutors have stated it. And yet, the system allowed them to extract over $13 billion and then largely protect that wealth from the consequences of how it was made. The buildings and galleries that once carried the Sackler name are now removing it, replacing those plaques with blank walls or new donors. But the money remains, and the deaths continue. Over 500,000 Americans have died from opioid overdoses since OxyContin was launched in 1996. That number increases every day. And the family that profited most from the crisis that killed them has never faced criminal charges, never been imprisoned, and, after paying settlements, will likely remain billionaires. Now tell me, did you know the full story behind the Sackler fortune? Leave your opinion in the comments, and suggest what other corporate scandals or hidden business empires you'd like to see uncovered. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel to support investigations into the stories that shape our world, even when those stories are too painful to ignore.